a shotgun, a note, a body in a greenhouse, and a truth that never sat right. April 1994, the world was told Kurt Cobain had ended his own life. But what if the story we've been fed for decades isn't the whole truth? What if behind the walls of fame, fortune, and love, there was something darker, something staged, something designed to silence the voice of a generation? The world remembers the image. A slender figure, hair falling across his face, guitar slung low, eyes half hidden as if he already saw too much. His voice carried the weight of a generation, raw, wounded, beautiful, and broken. But behind that voice, behind the songs that screamed of pain and longing, lay a life on a collision course with mystery, tragedy, and an ending that has never fully been understood. This is the story of Kurt Cobain, a star who burned too bright, too fast, and left behind questions that will never die. In the damp, gray town of Aberdeen, Washington. Kurt Donald Cobain was born on February 20th, 1967. His childhood wasn't the golden picture of happiness one might expect from someone destined for legend. His family was ordinary, working class, struggling against the same tides that pull at small-town America. But Kurt was different. From the time he was little, he drew, he painted, he listened. The world was too loud, too harsh, and he was too sensitive to bear it without scars. When his parents divorced, Kurt's world cracked in two. That divorce would haunt him, seeping into his music, into his words, into his soul. He would later say it felt like his sense of safety had been ripped away. A boy who once loved to laugh became quiet, troubled, drifting in and out of family homes, never quite belonging anywhere. This rootlessness, this sense of abandonment, would etch itself into every lyric he would write. As a teenager, Kurt discovered punk rock, and something inside him caught fire. Bands like the Sex Pistols and Black Flag spoke to his own chaos. Their rawness wasn't polished or perfect. It was real, jagged, screaming against a world that didn't care. That sound would bleed into the birth of Nirvana, but it was more than music. For Kurt, it was survival. He picked up a guitar and didn't just play it, he attacked it, coaxed it, screamed through it. His music wasn't just chords and notes. It was confession, therapy, blood on the strings. In small garages and dingy clubs, he began to shape the voice of what would later be called Generation X. A voice tired of lies, weary of pretense, aching with disillusionment. But even as his music grew, so did the shadows. Kurt struggled with chronic pain, a stomach condition that doctors never fully explained. That pain gnawed at him, and in searching for relief, he found drugs. What began as experimentation soon spiraled into dependence. Heroin became both his comfort and his curse. It dulled the agony but chained him in ways he could never escape. By the late 1980s, Nirvana was born. With Chris Novoselic on bass and later Dave Grohl on drums, the band wasn't just a sound, it was an earthquake. Their second album, Nevermind, exploded onto the scene in 1991, and suddenly Kurt Cobain was no longer a lost kid from Aberdeen. He was the reluctant voice of millions. Songs like Smells Like Teen Spirit and Come As You Are weren't just hits. They were anthems, cries for identity, raw truths dressed in distortion. The world crowned him king of grunge, but Kurt wanted none of it. Fame was a cage. Paparazzi hounded him, fans idolized him, critics dissected him. For someone who had always felt like an outsider, the spotlight was blinding, suffocating. He said once that he never wanted to be a rock star, only an artist. Yet the machinery of fame had swallowed him whole, and there was no way out. At the center of his storm came Courtney Love. Their relationship was chaotic, passionate, destructive, and inseparable. To outsiders, they were rock's Romeo and Juliet. two troubled souls bound together by love, addiction, and volatility. To insiders, they were a ticking bomb. Together, they had a daughter, Frances Bean Cobain, born in 1992, a fragile light in the middle of so much darkness. But even fatherhood couldn't anchor Kurt completely. His demons kept circling. The music industry wanted more from him, more hits, more tours, more exposure. But Kurt wanted to escape. He withdrew, he lashed out, he used. By 1993, Nirvana recorded their haunting MTV Unplugged in New York performance, a set that would later feel like a funeral before the funeral. Dressed in a green cardigan, surrounded by candles and lily, Kurt's voice carried an otherworldly weight. Songs like Where Did You Sleep Last Night dripped with finality, with a ghostly sadness that unsettled everyone who heard it. Looking back, it sounded less like a concert and more like a farewell. The shadows closed in further in early 1994. His health deteriorated, his addiction worsened, and his relationship strained. He had everything: fame, success, love, but he felt nothing. Depression hollowed him out. Attempts at rehab faltered. He would vanish, then return, always fragile, always teetering. Those closest to him grew terrified, sensing something inevitable. And then came April 1994. Kurt Cobain was found dead in his Seattle home, a shotgun wound to the head, a note left behind. Officially ruled a suicide. The world froze. The voice of a generation was gone, silenced at only 27 years old. Fans wept, conspiracy theories erupted, and a legend was cemented. But even as the news spread, so did the questions, because nothing about Kurt's death seemed simple. Nothing felt fully explained. The note, was it really a suicide letter? Or something else? The gunshot, the drugs in his system, the timeline of his final days. Every detail has been dissected for decades, and the shadows refuse to lift. This was no ordinary tragedy. This was the birth of a mystery that endures to this day. Did Kurt Cobain truly take his own life? Or was something far more sinister at play? The answers hide in fragments, in testimonies, in contradictions, in secrets left untold. And as we move deeper into Kurt's story, the lines between truth and illusion blur until nothing feels certain anymore. And just as the world thought it had said goodbye, whispers began to surface. Whispers of evidence overlooked, of motives concealed, of voices silenced. What really happened to Kurt Cobain on those final days of April? The story is just beginning. The final weeks of Kurt Cobain's life felt like a storm gathering in silence, each day darker than the last, each moment carrying the weight of something inevitable. To those around him, Kurt was slipping further into a world no one could quite reach, drifting between the brilliance of his music and the torment of his mind. In March 1994, Nirvana arrived in Europe for what would become their final tour. The band was exhausted. Kurt was in pain, physically and emotionally. The pressures of fame, the grind of endless performances, and the chaos of his private life pressed down harder than ever. On March 1st, Nirvana played a show in Munich, Germany. The night was bleak, the venue cold and uncomfortable, and Kurt's voice cracked under the weight of illness. It was not just another concert. It felt off. That performance would be the last time Kurt Cobain ever took the stage. Only days later, he was discovered in a Rome hotel, unconscious from what was described as an overdose of champagne and rohypnol. The official word was that it was an accident. Courtney Love later claimed it was his first suicide attempt. But even in that moment, the truth was murky. Was it an accident? A cry for help? Or a rehearsal for something darker yet to come? When Kurt returned to Seattle, his world only grew more suffocating. Friends described him as quiet, distant, a ghost moving through familiar places. Courtney urged him toward rehab, desperate to save him. desperate to anchor him to life. Their love was volatile, but she feared losing him more than anything else. Kurt agreed, reluctantly, to enter treatment. In late March, he checked into the Exodus Recovery Center in Los Angeles, a place meant to heal him. But Kurt was never one to be caged. On March 30th, 1994, he walked out of that facility, scaling a 6-foot wall to freedom. No one stopped him. No one knew exactly where he went. For days, he seemed to vanish, slipping through the cracks of a city too large to notice one man hiding within it. During that time, rumors swirled. Some said he returned quietly to Seattle. Others whispered he was spotted at gun shops, wandering alone. Those final days of Kurt Cobain's life remain a puzzle that no one has solved. Friends claimed he was despondent, yet others described moments of calm, even laughter. Courtney Love hired a private investigator, Tom Grant, to track him, fearing the worst. Grant uncovered inconsistencies in credit card charges after Kurt was supposedly gone, conflicting accounts of his movements, and strange gaps in the timeline. Each detail only deepened the mystery. On April 8, 1994, an electrician arrived at the Cobain home to install a security system. What he found changed music history forever. In a room above the garage, behind closed doors, Kurt Cobain lay lifeless. A shotgun rested on his chest. Beside him, a note, scrawled in uneven handwriting. The official conclusion: suicide. Age 27. Another name in the infamous 27 Club. But the world was not satisfied, because the note didn't read like a farewell to life. It read more like a goodbye to the music industry, a declaration of frustration, exhaustion, and farewell to fame. The final lines, addressed to his daughter, Frances, and to Courtney, seemed almost added tagged on, inconsistent in style, almost as if another hand had written them. Handwriting experts debated for years. Was the note genuine? Or was it altered to frame a narrative? Then, there were the toxicology reports. High levels of heroin and diazepam were found in Kurt's system. Experts questioned, could a man so incapacitated even operate a shotgun? Could he load it, aim it, and fire? Or was the scene staged, a death made to look like suicide? The gun itself added more shadows. There were no clear fingerprints. The shell casing lay in an odd position. The timeline between Kurt leaving rehab and being discovered remained blurry, with gaps investigators never fully explained. For Courtney, the tragedy was unbearable. For Frances, only a baby at the time, it was a loss she would grow up carrying without memory, only stories. For fans, it was a wound that never healed. But for investigators, journalists, and conspiracy theorists, Kurt's death became an obsession. Tom Grant, the private investigator Courtney had hired, became one of the loudest voices questioning the suicide ruling. He argued that evidence had been overlooked, that powerful motives for foul play existed, and that the truth had been buried under a convenient label of another troubled rock star gone too soon. His theories pointed in many directions, to Courtney herself, to the pressures of fame, to shadowy figures within the music industry. Each theory was darker than the last dot over the years. More testimonies surfaced. Friends claimed Kurt had been talking about leaving Nirvana, walking away from the industry entirely. Some suggested divorce was on the horizon between him and Courtney. Others whispered about money, control, inheritance, motives that stretch beyond love and into greed. But here lies the core of the mystery. Kurt Cobain was more than just a rock star. He was a symbol, a cultural phenomenon. His death wasn't simply personal, it was global. And with global legends come global shadows. Did Kurt Cobain truly choose to end his own life in that room in Seattle? Or did someone else choose it for him? The world may never know. But the closer we look at those last days, the more the pieces fail to fit. The more the story refuses to settle into a single truth. And just as the official reports tried to close the book, a darker truth kept scratching at the surface, refusing to stay buried, because every mystery has a key. And in Kurt's story, that key might not be in what was found in that room, but in what was missing. And the deeper we dig, the more dangerous the truth becomes. The shadows are only beginning to stir. The official story was clean, too clean. A troubled musician, overwhelmed by fame, swallowed by addiction, chose to end his life. It was the narrative the world was given. It was the narrative millions accepted. But beneath the surface, behind police reports and headlines, cracks began to show. Cracks that widened into gaping holes until the story of Kurt Cobain's death was no longer a simple tragedy, but something far more sinister. It began with Tom Grant, hired by Courtney Love to track Kurt in those missing days after he fled rehab. Grant became a reluctant crusader. At first, he believed the narrative he was told, a distraught husband, a concerned wife. But as he dug deeper, the pieces stopped making sense. Why would a man with so much heroin in his system have the strength, coordination, and clarity to operate a shotgun? Why would he write a note that sounded more like a resignation from music than a farewell to life? Why were certain details of the investigation sloppy, overlooked, dismissed? The Seattle police closed the case within days, declaring suicide. They photographed little, collected minimal evidence, and sealed the file. But for those who dared to look closer, the haste itself became suspicious. Why rush closure unless there was something to hide? One of the most troubling details was the toxicology report. The heroin level in Kurt's blood was staggeringly high, 3 times the lethal dose. Medical experts argued that with that much in his system, Kurt would have been unconscious within seconds, if not dead already. How then could he have positioned the gun, pulled the trigger, and staged his own death? The science pointed to impossibility, yet the conclusion remained unchanged. The note, too, cast its own shadow. The bulk of it read like Kurt was leaving the music industry, speaking of his frustrations, his disillusionment, his weariness with fame. Only at the end did it turn personal, mentioning Courtney and Francis. Handwriting experts later studied those final lines. Some claimed the style differed from the rest of the letter. Was it all written by Kurt? Or did someone add the last lines to transform a farewell to fame into a suicide note? Then came the gun. The shotgun Kurt allegedly used had been purchased in strange circumstances. Officially, it was registered in a friend's name, not Kurt's, supposedly to avoid media attention. But why would a man planning suicide care about paperwork? Stranger still, the weapon carried no legible fingerprints, despite the fact it was supposedly fired by Kurt himself. Was it wiped clean? Or handled by someone else before being staged at the scene? Tom Grant pointed a finger directly at Courtney Love, not out of malice, but because the inconsistencies led him there. He claimed Courtney had motives. Kurt had been planning to divorce her, cut ties, potentially cut her off from financial security. For Grant, the narrative was clear. Kurt's death was not self-inflicted, but orchestrated. Courtney denied every accusation, calling them outrageous, the ramblings of a bitter man desperate for attention. But the suspicions never died. Others suggested darker forces at play. Kurt Cobain wasn't just a musician, he was a cultural force. Unpredictable, uncontrollable, unwilling to play by the industry's rules. He spoke of quitting Nirvana, leaving the spotlight, disappearing. For record labels, for managers, for those who had built empires on his fame, his departure would have meant chaos, financial collapse. Was his death more convenient than his survival? Was silencing him easier than letting him walk away? And then there was the eerie presence of the 27 Club. Kurt's death at 27 placed him alongside legends like Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison, all musicians, all gone at the same age, all under suspicious or tragic circumstances. Coincidence? Or part of something larger, a curse woven through the history of rock and fame? Fans whispered of fate, destiny, even occult forces. The number itself became myth, and Kurt became its most iconic victim. Interviews with those close to him only deepened the shadows. Some described Kurt as suicidal, fragile, exhausted. Others insisted he was planning for the future, speaking of projects, of fatherhood, of finding a way out of the chaos. Which version was true? Could both exist a man torn between hope and despair, life and death? Or did one narrative serve a purpose, constructed to fit an ending that had already been written for him? As the years passed, documentaries, books, and interviews kept the mystery alive. Kurt and Courtney, directed by Nick Broomfield, reignited debate by openly questioning the official story. The 2015 documentary Soaked in Bleach, based on Tom Grant's findings, laid out evidence suggesting murder rather than suicide. Fans demanded the case be reopened. The Seattle police, under pressure, briefly reviewed the files in 2014, releasing unseen photographs. But the ruling remained the same: suicide. Case closed. At least, officially. But official stories don't silence ghosts. They don't stop whispering in the dark. They don't erase contradictions or explain away evidence that doesn't fit. The mystery of Kurt Cobain's death persists because the truth, whatever it is, was buried with him. And the deeper you look, the less certain you become. For millions, Kurt wasn't just another celebrity lost too soon. He was the fragile mirror of their own lives, proof that even those who seem untouchable can break. His music was their confession, their cry, their truth. His death was their silence. And in that silence, questions echo still. Was Kurt Cobain truly a man who gave in to his demons, or a victim of forces that refused to let him go? The answer lies not just in Seattle, not just in 1994, but in the shadows that stretch across fame itself. Because Kurt Cobain's story doesn't end with death. It only grows darker the further we go. And the next revelation may be the one that changes everything. The tragedy of Kurt Cobain's death should have been the end of the story. A closed book, a final chapter. But in the silence that followed, voices rose, carrying fragments, suspicions, and confessions that kept the mystery alive. Every testimony painted a slightly different picture. Every whisper suggested a darker truth. And in these conflicting echoes, the figure of Kurt Cobain became more elusive than ever. The first shadow always fell on Courtney Love. She was the widow, the grieving wife, the mother left to raise a daughter alone. But to others, she was volatile, manipulative, and desperate to hold on to control. Friends recalled arguments, threats of divorce, signs that Kurt was pulling away. If he left, what would she lose? Not just love, but money, fame, power, the very scaffolding of her world. Tom Grant's investigation suggested motive, even opportunity. For years, Courtney denied these accusations, branding them lies designed to tear her down. Yet the suspicion stuck, like smoke that refuses to clear. Others turned their gaze elsewhere. Dylan Carlson, Kurt's close friend, was the one who purchased the shotgun that ended his life. He insisted it was for protection, but Kurt feared intruders, stalkers, strangers. But why would a man planning suicide ask for protection? Why would he conceal the gun under another name? Dylan's loyalty to Kurt was unquestioned, yet his role in those final days left more questions than answers. Then there was Michael Kali DeWitt, the nanny who lived with Kurt and Courtney. In the days before Kurt's body was discovered, DeWitt was seen around the Cobain home, his movements unclear, his statements conflicting. He admitted to seeing signs Kurt had returned from rehab, but said nothing. Why? Some claimed he was under Courtney's influence. Others whispered he knew more than he ever revealed. even the police came under scrutiny. Their investigation was criticized as rushed, careless, almost deliberately shallow. Photographs of the scene were limited. Evidence went missing. Items were discarded too quickly. The very people tasked with finding the truth seemed intent only on closing the case. Was it incompetence? Or was it something more deliberate? And hanging over it all was the note. The handwriting, the tone, the sudden shift in voice. Handwriting experts debated whether the final lines were genuine. Tom Grant went further, suggesting they were forged, added to turn Kurt's frustrations into a confession of suicide. If true, the note was not evidence but staging the most chilling piece of theater imaginable. But beyond suspects and theories lay the aftermath, a tidal wave that swept across the world. Fans gathered in Seattle, sobbing, screaming, holding vigils that burned deep into the night. Some couldn't bear it. In the days after Kurt's death, several fans took their own lives, convinced the world had lost its voice and that silence was unbearable. The weight of Kurt's passing was not just personal. It was cultural. It was seismic. The media framed him as another fallen rock star, another victim of fame, another number in the 27 Club. But those who knew him, those who studied his life, argued it was never that simple. Kurt was more than the cliché of the tortured artist. He was complicated, brilliant, contradictory. He loved deeply, cared fiercely for his daughter, dreamed of escape, even of quiet anonymity. Could such a man truly have given in so suddenly, so violently? Or was he silenced because he wanted to break free? In the years after, Frances Bean Cobain grew up under the shadow of a father she never truly knew. Interviews revealed her struggles with carrying his legacy, with facing the endless conspiracy theories, the endless images of a man she only knew in fragments. For her, the mystery wasn't a cultural obsession. It was a personal wound that would never heal. Courtney Love's path spiraled through chaos, lawsuits, feuds, accusations. Some saw her as the grieving widow, others as the prime suspect. The division was stark, unending. Each new interview, each new revelation reignited the flames. But through it all, Kurt's music endured. His voice refused to die. Songs like Lithium, Heart-Shaped Box, and All Apologies became more than music. They became clues, messages, fragments of a man reaching out from beyond the grave. Fans dissected lyrics, searching for hidden meanings, prophecies of his end. Every word became evidence, every line a piece of testimony. Was he confessing through his art, or were fans hearing what they wanted to hear? The deeper you look, the more the story resists clarity. Every suspect could be guilty. Every suspect could be innocent. Every piece of evidence could be truth or manipulation. The mystery of Kurt Cobain's death is not just a question of who pulled the trigger, but of why the world needed a clean story so badly it ignored the cracks in the foundation. Because if Kurt didn't take his own life, then someone else did. And if someone else did, the cover-up wasn't just sloppy. It was intentional. The truth lies buried in police files, in testimonies long silenced, in photographs that may never be released. But every year, every decade, the demand for answers only grows louder. And those who dig too deep sometimes find more than they bargained for. Kurt Cobain's death is not just a mystery of a man. It is the mystery of fame itself. And as we turn to the darkest corners of this story, the question shifts from what happened to who wanted it to happen. And once we step into that darkness, there may be no turning back. The years after Kurt's death unfolded like a crime novel without an ending. Reporters dug, fans obsessed, and investigators like Tom Grant refused to let the official story rest. New evidence surfaced in fragments of inconsistencies in the autopsy, missing fingerprints on the shotgun, a suspiciously high dose of heroin in Kurt's system that should have left him unconscious long before he could pull any trigger. Each detail became a spark, igniting arguments in courtrooms of public opinion, fueling documentaries, podcasts, and late-night theories whispered in dark rooms. Courtney, love's presence loomed over every retelling. To some, she was the devastated widow who inherited only pain. To others, she was the one who benefited most from fame, from fortune, from a rewritten narrative that painted Kurt as unstable, dangerous to himself, doomed by his addictions. But in the shadows, there are those who swear Courtney's behavior in the days before and after Kurt's death was not grief, but calculation. The Seattle police, too, are caught in the storm of suspicion. They ruled it suicide within hours, before critical evidence could be tested, before questions were answered. Files went missing. Photographs never saw the light of day until years later. When released, they raised more questions than they answered. Was it negligence? Or was it a cover-up? Meanwhile, Kurt became more than a man. He became a symbol. The 27 Club, the martyr of Generation X, the reluctant king of grunge. His image is immortalized on posters, murals, and tattoos, while his voice drips through the speakers of those who still feel the sting of his absence. But behind the art lies a lingering chill, a sense that we are remembering him through a lie, that the true story of Kurt Cobain's end is still locked away in silence. And that silence is deafening. The closer you look, the darker it becomes. Friends who won't speak. Investigators silenced or ridiculed. A widow who swings between mourning and rage. A police department unwilling to reopen the case, despite the cries of thousands who see the cracks in the official tale. Every thread pulled leads to another shadow, another contradiction. And the more you ask, the more dangerous it feels. Because if Kurt Cobain was silenced, then by whom? And why? The story does not end in that greenhouse. It begins there. And the trail that follows leads not only to Kurt's death, but to the darkest truths about fame, power, and what it cost to question them. As time passed, the official story began to rot under the weight of unanswered questions. It wasn't just the inconsistencies. It was the patterns. Patterns that stretched far beyond Seattle. Patterns that whispered of a hidden machinery behind fame itself. Kurt's death was not the first to leave the world stunned, and it would not be the last. Jim Morrison, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, all gone at 27. All artists who struggled with the chains of fame, all silenced under suspicious circumstances. Their deaths ruled accidents, overdoses, or suicides. To some, the 27 Club was nothing but coincidence. To others, it was a curse or worse, a design. When investigators revisited Kurt's case, they noticed details that felt eerily familiar to those earlier tragedies. A sudden change in behavior before death. Conflicting witness statements. Missing evidence. Narratives tied neatly in a bow before the questions could even be asked. Was it a chance? Or was there a thread linking them? A silent hand removing those who threatened to disrupt the system that profited from them? Courtney Love's role became more complex in these theories. Some painted her as the mastermind. Others saw her as a pawn in a much larger game. Her grief manipulated, her silence ensured. Conspiracies grew darker whispers of industry figures with everything to lose if Kurt walked away from Nirvana, from his contracts, from the empire. His voice had built. Tom Grant's tapes revealed chilling details. Recordings of phone calls, testimonies from those close to Kurt, hints of plots and betrayals. But with every release, Tom found himself dismissed as obsessed, crazy, unwilling to move on. The media, quick to exploit Kurt's image, seemed equally quick to bury any deeper investigation into his death. And yet, fans refused to let go. Vigils became protests. Online forums turned into digital crime boards. The hunt for truth became almost religious, a desperate belief that uncovering what really happened would give. Kurt the Justice denied him in life, but the deeper the rabbit hole went, the more dangerous the questions became. Those who spoke too loudly about Kurt's death often found themselves silenced, ridiculed, or ignored. And the more voices disappeared, the more it felt like something bigger was at work. Because maybe Kurt wasn't just a musician crushed by fame. Maybe he was a threat, a man who wanted to expose the very system that made him. And if that's true, then his death wasn't the end of a life. It was the beginning of a cover-up. And in that silence, one chilling question grows louder every year. If Kurt Cobain was silenced, who might be next?